Okay, good evening, everyone, and welcome to another kashrut class. Today, we're going to look at kashering livers, which is not something you do every day, and a little easier, how to buy fish in the supermarket or in the local fishmonger or fish shop, whatever mutual fish that we have here or other places, how you do it. So, let's begin with liver. Liver is a very interesting one because it is full of blood. And as we all know, we cannot eat blood. So the job here is to remove the blood from the liver, which is not an easy thing to do. Normally, when it comes to removing blood, all we do is we salt it, we rinse it, we salt it, we rinse it. It's a whole procedure. But that doesn't work with liver, okay? In fact, the Gemara Masechet Chulin talks about how there are many things which are prohibited to us, but there is something permitted in there for us to eat. And Yalta said to her husband, Rav Nachman, Michti, kol da'asalan rachmana, sharalan kavate. Everything that is forbidden in this world, when anything which is forbidden in the Torah, HaKadosh Baruch Hu permits us to do it in another similar vein. Asarlan dama, we're not allowed to eat blood. Sharalan kavda, but we are permitted to eat livers, and it goes into other cases of things. You're not allowed to marry a divorce. You're not allowed to marry. You're not allowed to have relations with a married woman, but you are allowed to marry that woman once she is divorced, even if her husband is still alive. You're not allowed to marry your brother's wife, but if he passes away, you're obligated to marry her. And other examples like that. But the practical case here is the Gemara is telling us that liver has the taste of blood. Why does it have the taste of blood? Because it's full of blood. What the Gemara does not tell us is, how do you go around to eat it? By the way, there's another example here what it tells you. We're not allowed to eat meat and milk, but you are allowed to eat udders, which is utterly ridiculous. And that's for my wife who just joined us. Utterly, utterly ridiculous. And that's another whole section about how you make a udder kosher, and it involves a similar process to how we make a liver kosher, which involves we're going to go into this, which is crisscrossing, and we're going to see it here. So Shulchan Aruch says in source number 19, Hakaved yosh bo ribui dam, liver is full of blood. Lefichach, therefore, lechatchila eino takana lebashlo al yedei melicha. Therefore, ideally, it is not, you cannot kasher it through mere salting. Ela Koro shativa arib. Rather, what you need to do is tear it crisscross manner. Umania chitocho lamata v'tzolehu sheyeh raui lachila v'achar kach yachol levashlo. So what do you have to do? You have to do this crisscross pattern across the surface, facing down, and you roast it to the point where it is fit to eat. And then one may cook it. So the only way to kasher a liver is by roasting it. And you make these crisscross cuts, and that's how you do it. And because my mom will be watching it later, she called me when she heard I was giving a class on livers this morning, and she said, 25 years ago, in honor of my bar mitzvah, she spent 2 days kashering livers for my bar mitzvah to make chopped liver in the Ashkenazic style for about 60 closest friends and family who came for lunch that day. So she said she was very thankful that she kept the lunch to 60 because she spent 2 days cutting these livers crisscross with my sister to kasher them in order to make this liver dish. Which is ironic because when I was 13, I thought livers were horrible. And now, if you ask me one of my favorite dishes to eat, is when you go to Israel and you get them in those shipud stores, restaurants, when you go to those places and they got them on the those I don't know, they're called chipudim. They're skewers. And I tell you, there's nothing better than that with all the hummus and chatzilim and all the salatim. It's delicious. And even with my diet of low carbs and no fries, you can still go to the shipud place and have it with no pita and no fries. It's just not as fun. But you still get the meat and the dips, and it's very nice. But Shulchan Aruch says the only way to eat liver is roasting it. The Rama, the Ashkenazic rabbi Rav Moshe Isserles, who writes his comments on the Shulchan Aruch, adds in two places that it's customary to rinse the liver and place a small amount of salt on it prior to roasting, and then to rinse it again following the roasting, even though the salting doesn't do anything by itself. He says one shouldn't change the custom, just put a little bit of salt to remind ourselves that the normal way of koshering is salting and rinsing. Okay, but nonetheless, what are we saying? The only way it's permitted is through the roasting. Okay? And he says the custom there is to rinse it first as well as to salt it lightly. Okay, that's the position for the Ashkenazim, and no surprise that our Sephardic approach is not to follow that. However, there's nothing wrong with doing so. Regarding the level of heat, one should use a medium level fire, as if it is too low, it will not get broiled. If it's too high, the outside of the liver will get burnt, while the inside will not get broiled sufficiently. Okay, and you can see that there. So again, even with koshering, we need to make sure that we have the oven or the grill or whatever at the right temperature. Otherwise, you're going to have a problem there. Let's just read a quick process here. You know what? I'm not even sure I want to. We could, should we read this? You could read this on your own a little bit. It goes into how to do it. But basically, you heard my position on that. You need to cut it lengthwise and crosswise, and you got to. And some people salt it and rinse it lightly. It doesn't need to be for Sfaradim, and you eat it. Most people don't do it because it's very complicated to do so. My wife's asking me, do I remember when she made liver in Israel? I think that was a bad story there, so I can't remember. Do you want to share it? No.
It wasn't a bad story. It was just a huge amount of work. It was this massive undertaking for like this much. And you insisted it was really good, but that I did not need to repeat the process again based on how much was involved. And was a separate grill for that could be used for anything else. It was.
Yeah, correct. So thank you for mentioning that, Rubisa. So my wife, again, God bless her, she adds what I always forget. The problem with koshering livers isn't just the amount of work involved. The problem is that whatever you do to kosher a liver, you can only use for livers. You can't do it. It makes non-kosher anything else because of all the blood that comes out of it. So therefore, you only really want to be using disposable foils, and you want something to catch all the blood. Bottom line, this is a large labor of love. So unless you really, really love livers, best thing to do, once COVID is over, fly to Israel and enjoy some shipud al ha'esh, some beautiful, and I think that's probably what I'll do. We'll go and get some shipudim al ha'esh, some beautiful skewers on the fire. There's nothing better at it. And my brother will call the restaurant and we'll come and we'll make the order. It will be delicious. Now, something which is far more commonplace is buying kosher fish and how to do so. And what is it? Well, first we need to get into that, which is to be kosher fish, it needs to have both fins and scales. And in order to know that the fish is kosher, I need to see the skin on it to be able to know that it's kosher. The one main exception to this rule might be salmon, because of its color, there's very few things. In fact, there's nothing that salmon could be which would mark it for being non-kosher. Tuna, same thing, whether it's very reddish, pinkish color. But everything else, there are so many white fishes, which could be anything. You shouldn't really buy any of those fishes. And we'll see this because we're not sure 100% what they are. And that is that the person who's selling it to you, unless they are a God-fearing Jew, we are concerned that because of business, they are going to sell you something of an inferior quality and perhaps non-kosher fish, which looks identical purely to make money. And there have been many, many cases throughout the years, not just in modern times, but throughout history, where people try to sell you something and it is not what it is. It doesn't always say what it says on the can or the tin. Now, you might wonder, why is it with fish we don't require any ritual slaughter like we do with birds and with domesticated animals? Well, the Gemara Masechet Chulin on 27b goes into that example and explains it there. Dagim delav b'nei shechita ninhu. Fish don't require shechita. Minalan, how do we know this? If we say it's because of the pasuk, Hatzon ha'uvaka yeshachet lahem, if flocks and herds be slaughtered for them, or if all the fish of the sea be gathered together for them, which indicates that mere gathering suffices them, that's not going to be a proof. But if that is so, regarding quail, it also says, and they gathered the quail. So too, one would say regard to birds, that they don't require slaughter, and we know that they do. So the Gemara responds, but didn't you say to exempt birds from slaughter altogether with nothing is impossible, as it was already juxtaposed, it was taught together with animal slaughter. The Gemara answers, there, gathering of quail is not written in the context of slaughter of others. Therefore, gathering is not to be understood as an alternative to slaughtering the birds. Here, gathering of fish is written in the context of slaughtering of others, i.e. the flocks and herds, which indicates that gathering is an alternative to slaughter. So basically, long and short of it, through the Gemara's logic, which is very complicated to follow here, you might have thought, logically, that merely gathering would be sufficient not only for fish, but also for birds. But since the birds are taught that they require slaughtering, just like domesticated animals and wild animals, so too, and therefore that's why they are. So even though it talks about gathering for birds as well, they too require slaughtering. But with fish, they only have the gathering comment. There's no mention of slaughter anywhere, and that's why it's enough just to gather them out of the water, and they don't require slaughtering. Now, you have to ask me to really explain that properly. It's a tough one. It really is. I will just say, that's our tradition. That's the way we learn the Pesukim, and that's enough. Sometimes it's enough to say, that's how it is, because if that wasn't our tradition, I could argue and say the birds also shouldn't require shechita, but they do. Birds require shechita just as animals and all the different types of animals. Whereas fish, it's just enough that they're pulled out of the water. And as I mentioned to you, the scales. There are a few issues to be aware of concerning preparing kosher fish. Mainly, the stage of identifying and purchasing the fish. According to Torah, they have to have snapir bekaskeset, fins and scales. As it says in Parashat Shemini, et zeh tochelu mikol asher bamayim, kol asher lo snapir bekaskeset bamayim bayamim v'nechalim, otam tochelu. Among all creatures that are in the water, you may eat these. Any of the creatures in the water that has fins and scales, those you may eat, whether it lives in the waters, in the seas, or in the rivers. And then the Mishnah says, Kol sheyesh lo kaskeset, all that have scales, yesh lo snapir has fins. V'yesh sheyesh lo snapir, but there are those that have fins, ve'en lo kaskeset, but do not have scales. Yesh lo kaskeset, ve'yesh lo snapir, those which have both fins and scales, dag tahor is a kosher fish. Yesh lo snapir ve'eno kaskeset, if it has the fins but without the scales, then it is a dag tameh. It's a non-kosher animal. It's a non-kosher fish. So based on this, one who wishes to identify a kosher fish and is not easily able to see the fins may suffice with identifying the scales on the skin of the fish. This is the accepted halacha in the Shulchan Aruch. Kol sheyesh lo kaskesa yesh lo snapir. Every fish that has scales has fins, but some have fins but don't have scales. Therefore, if one found a piece of fish that has scales, you don't need to look for the fins. But if one had fins, one may not eat it unless one knows that it has scales. So practically speaking, when we're looking for a fish, I want to see the skin, because the skin is going to show me those scales. And then the Ramban goes into halachic scales are limited to those that are peeled off easily from the skin. You can have a look at that on your own in source number 28. The Rama adds, it is specifically when the scales can be peeled off by hand or by utensil, but if it is impossible to peel them off from the skin or the flesh, they are not called scales, okay? And that's how we rule, okay. And then the Shulchan Aruch says, even if it has only one fin and one scale, it's kasher. And even if it does not have now, but it will eventually grow them, or it had while it was still in the water, and they were then shed when it ascended to land, it is permitted. But some say that one should not permit the fish with one scale, except when it is found underneath the jaw tail or fin, and it's good to be stringent about this. Now, this is a very interesting situation that fish such as tuna and mackerel, where their scales are shed when they leave the water. And yet we know them to be kosher fish. Okay? Whereas fish such as sturgeon and burbot fish are not kosher despite having scales, because their scales cannot be removed without parts of the skin being detached as well. And then there's a discussion about swordfish, whether it's kasher or not. And there's a whole discussion about, and you can look about this. I remember I didn't grow up in Gibraltar, but I know that going to Gibraltar, there's a whole discussion. There are people who did eat swordfish, people who didn't eat swordfish, because swordfish is very prevalent there. It's one of those where, in Israel, it does, some places do give it a hechsher, others do not. It's beyond the scope of this class to talk about it. But, if you buy it with a hechsher, I think you have what to rely on, but there are those who are concerned about it. And I can definitely talk to people offline about that. Now, if one wishes to purchase or consume a fish without kosher certification on the fish or on the store, it's permitted to do so based upon these sources. Though one must be able to identify that the fish contains scales that are indeed easy to peel off without the skin, as per the Ramban and the Rama. Okay, so how can I know if a fish is kosher? This is found on the OU by Rabbi Chaim Goldberg. To check if a fish is kosher, one must ascertain that the scales can be properly removed. A kaskeset are attached on the side of the fish, closer to the head, and are not attached on the side closer to the tail. To remove it, one must grasp the side that is not attached and gently pluck it from the side of the fish. If removing the scale did not damage the skin, then the fish is kosher. Now, I like that, all very well and good. But unless you're a real fish person, and I'm not one of those, I don't want to go there. I know which fish is kosher and what aren't. I know the types. So if I'm going to the fish store, I want to get salmon, or I want to get tuna, or I want to get haddock, mackerel, hake, whatever it's going to be, halibut, the fish which I know that are kosher, tilapia. Can I buy those? How do I buy them? So we got this question of fish that have already been filleted or filleted. An even more difficult problem arises when one wishes to buy fish fillet. Once the fish has been skinned, it's nearly impossible even for an expert to positively identify a fish, as many have similar appearances, including kosher and non-kosher ones. Of course, there is not a major issue for one who shops in a kosher fish market or buys a fish with kosher symbols, but that's not always possible. So if I go into a store, let's say I want to get it from QRC, can I do that? How do I do it? So the best way to do it is to have a religious Jew assert that the skin was removed and that the fish is kosher. But as I said, that's very difficult to do. So how do we do it? So here, point to these questions. My local fish store is not under rabbinic supervision. It sells fillets without skin. How could I tell if the fish they are selling are kosher? His answer is you can't, even if fish is halibut, whitefish, or carp. Once the skin is removed, it's impossible to identify and it cannot be assumed to be kosher. In determining the kosher status of fish, identity is critical. There are two ways to identify kosher fish. Number one, by removing a kosher scale from the skin, as we talked about, and number two, by recognizing the fish as being from a kosher species. One could only recognize a fish species if the skin is intact. So the general rule that I tell people is, if in doubt, you must buy fish which has the skin there. And I tell you, you can do this. Even, for example, at Trader Joe's, you can buy salmon which has skin on, and you can buy salmon which has skin off. Now, I told you salmon is different because of its color. But let's say it was a white fish. If it has its skin, I can see those scales, and therefore it's much easier to buy, and that's what I would say to get. The exception again being salmon because of what that is. Another issue that arises when purchasing fish in a store without kosher supervision is the equipment they use. Even if the scales are still on the fish and one can positively identify the fish, the store employee may not generally use the store knife to cut the fish, as the knife has also been used to cut non-kosher fish, and there may not be leftover residue. He says here, if one cuts, the Shulchan Aruch says, one cuts cucumbers with a meat knife, it is permitted to eat them with dairy with scraping of the cucumber alone if he scrapes the location of the cut. And that's true of meat and milk. And if that is true, then we can be. The reason why the cucumber must be scraped is that it is assumed that the knife may contain residue on it from the other meat foods cut previously. In our case too, one must be concerned that the knife used in the fish store was used recently to cut non-kosher fish and contains some residue on it, which is not always easy to remove. However, Rav Kaganov explains that one is permitted to bring one's own knife and cutting board and ask the fish seller to cut the kosher fish using them. If that's impossible, one may have him thoroughly wash and scrape the store's knife and cutting board first. So again, the best possible way to do so is to go to a store like Mutual Fish. They have kosher knives and boards. Make sure the knives and boards are clean and have them cut the fish in front of you. You can see the skin. They can fillet it for you. All is great, whatever you want to do. That's not always the case. It's not always possible. So there are other ways to do so. One is in supermarkets. We know that they're going to be more careful to wash in between rounds, and therefore, when buying something like the salmon, we know that it's only been salmon they've been using it to cut for. And in here, this final piece here is talking about a fishy tail. How can someone purchase fresh fish if he lives in an area that does not yet have a kosher fish market? Since he may not rely on the fishmonger's assurances, must he forego purchasing a fresh fish? There is a perfectly acceptable halakhic solution. One should go to the fish store, identify a fish that still has its skin on, and identify the scales. One should then provide the store with one's own knife and supervise the fish filleting. That's, again, the best way to do it. The fish store knives usually have a thin layer of grease from other, possibly non-kosher fish. One cannot assume that the store cleans the knives between fish to the extent halakha requires. In the rare instance the shop is reticent to allow the use of private knives, then you should supervise that the knives are scraped extremely clean. Standard cleaning does not guarantee that the grease has been removed from the knife. But as I said, in some places, they often work with us to make it so that it is permissible. Now, all that being said, that is the most strict positions you can find out there. And I will still tell you that when it comes, if I know that the fish is kosher and I can see the skin and they show me the knife and it is clean, if you're not at Mutual Fish, which has special kosher knives, but you can show you that the knife is clean thoroughly, then I think you can rely on that to buy your kosher fish. Now, regarding which fish you can buy which do not have skin, I only recommend salmon and at a pinch, tuna if I'm really out of town and it's hard to find. Otherwise, white fish, there is no way to be reliant upon it. And I was even away recently and my wife reminded me, I found some really beautiful cod and my wife said, there's no skin on it. We're out of town. It's white fish. Big thumbs down on that. So I'm just telling you, even the rabbis, it's a challenge because, it's a great deal. It's a great price. If it doesn't have it, don't do it. But regarding frozen fish, there's tons and tons of them which have hechshers at no extra price. It's the same price for the hechshered frozen fish as the regular frozen fish. When it comes to fresh fish, you need a clean knife and you need to go and ask them and not be shy to ask them, please fillet this in front of me. And I'm very shy in the supermarkets. I don't like to do that, but every time I force myself, they don't charge you more, and they're always happy to do it. So let's just go outside of our comfort zone to make sure that the fish that we're buying is 100% kasher, and there's no concern of residue of non-kosher fish. That's it. That's all I have to share for tonight. Any questions?
I had a question, Rabbi.
Yes, Sarah.
Okay, that was going back to koshering liver. So let's say you've roasted the liver, then can't you just eat the roasted liver that way as opposed to having to cook it or do something else with it?
Oh, absolutely. You can just have it roasted. Yeah, 100%.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
That's the best way. I'm just saying some people like to take that roasted liver and mix it with eggs and onions and mayonnaise and make it into a chopped liver type thing. But absolutely, you can do it. The roasted on the fire is the best. Yeah.
I have a question.
Yes, Jeff.
Yeah, not relating to koshering, but and it may have been addressed in other sessions. The concept of not having, I've never got a good explanation of not eating fish and meat on the same plate. What
Great
is
question.
the halachic explanation? And I've heard mixed stories from Ashkenazim and Sephardi rabbis. So.
Good. So this is brought down in the Gemara in Masechet Chulin. I think it's 105a. And there the Gemara talks about you cannot eat fish and meat together because it is called a sakana, a danger. And the Gemara doesn't come and give an explanation of what the danger is. Some have suggested that the danger is by eating fish and meat together interchangeably, I may end up choking on a fish bone because I thought it was a piece of meat and I'm going to choke. Others have suggested that eating fish and meat together is just bad for your digestion and it's going to be a problem. We don't think it's that because there's no problem having fish as a starter and meat as an entree. There's never been an issue there of digestion. There are some rabbis today that I know of who eat fish and meat on the same plate and don't have a concern. However, the Sephardic and Ashkenazic normative approach across the board is to be careful with this and to have fish beforehand, wash out the mouth, and then go straight on to eating the meat in the next course. And the reason going is that we're more careful with a danger than we are with regular kashrut. It's not a kashrut issue, it's a danger issue that I might end up choking perhaps on those fish bones.
Great, thank you.
No problem, Jeff. I'm happy to see you. Thanks. All right. I promised Jerry I would finish at 7:30 because we've got mincha starting in just a few minutes. So I'll see you all next time. Take care.
Thank you very much.
Bye-bye.
Bye.